We're here this afternoon to interview Professor Christopher Exley, who's an expert on aluminium. Good afternoon, Christopher Exley.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background, please?
Yeah. I'm a biologist by profession. My first degree up at the University of Stirling in Scotland, where I went to Stirling because I had a fascination for fish and fishing. And Stirling was well known back in the 80s, and still is today, for having something called the Institute of Aquaculture, which is fish farming. And so I thought to myself, this was the place to go and do my undergraduate degree, and that's where I went. And in my final year of my undergraduate degree, I started to look for research projects, and the one that I found was to look at aluminium toxicity in fish. Because that time there was a main interest in terms of the environment was acid rain, that many of us will remember. And acid rain was killing fish in lakes and killing trees, and we had to understand why. And so I began research looking at whether aluminium was the main culprit in this. And that's what brought me into the subject area of working on aluminium. So that was back in 1984.
Now we understand that aluminium is a neurotoxin. Can you explain to the audience what neurotoxin is, please, so that they can understand?
Yeah, well, I think anything which causes a disruption in the function of the brain would be described as a neurotoxin. That can mean a direct effect upon the neurons of the brain, but it could also mean effects upon the non-neuronal cells, which are responsible for the housekeeping of the brain. In many ways, they're the sort of workers of the brain, and they facilitate the activities of the neurons. So anything that causes a disruption of those processes, which often can then lead to neuronal death, neurodegeneration. But generally, neuronal death is quite a long way down the line.
Yes.
So once things start going wrong in the brain, it's usually well in advance of loss of neurons.
Right, okay. What is the connection between aluminium and HPV vaccines? We know that aluminium is in the vaccines, but what is the connection? Why is it so important?
Well, as you probably know, and many of your audience will know, the vaccines, there are two main forms of vaccine. One has a live a live antigen, which might be a virus or a bacterium or something of that sort, whereas others have an inactivated antigen or inactivated microorganism. And those that have an inactivated antigen require something else to make them work effectively. And we call that other thing an adjuvant, from the Latin adjuvare. And those adjuvants essentially provide a boost to the immune response. Without them, the inactivated vaccine would not work. Now, aluminium or aluminium salts are the most common adjuvant used in all of those types of vaccination, and have been for nearly 100 years.
Why is that?
Well, historically we are told it's simply because that when the individuals who were involved with the early development of vaccines and vaccination were looking for the most appropriate adjuvant, they were in their labs and they decided to look on the chemistry shelves, and they began with the letter A, and the first one they picked up was alum, and alum worked. So that's why we're told, that's the sort of historical story that we're told about why that is the case. Obviously, aluminium salts do work extremely well in terms of providing the sort of immunological boost that is required. They are also dirt cheap. In other words, in the cost of a vaccine, the aluminium adjuvant has a cost of approximately 0 pence. So it is an incredibly cheap and effective way of getting an immune response from an inactivated vaccine. Indeed, without the aluminium adjuvant, the vaccine would not work at all. So it's an invaluable part of it, and yet it is absolutely 100%, as cheap as possible can be. The other aspect of this, which we need to think about, is that even though we've had about 100 years of using aluminium in many different ways, and therefore human exposure to aluminium has started at any sort of level around 100 or so years ago and is burgeoning today, the consensus of opinion out there in the wider world is always that these are relatively safe salts, that aluminium causes no damage. And so being able to use something which is considered safe, which has, as I said, costs absolutely nothing to the manufacturer, but also for which there has never been any sort of safety trial, there has never been any sort of regulation, so you can use it as much or as little as you wish without having to demonstrate its safety. And this has always been the case, not only in vaccines, in any form of use of aluminium to which we are exposed in our everyday life, there is no regulation whatsoever. I mean, people think there is. People think there's a regulation for aluminium in your water. There is. But you know what it's based on? It's based on, because we use aluminium to purify our water, drinking water, before it gets to our tap. They have a process at the treatment plant where the aluminium is used to take all the organic matter out of the water, to clean it, to purify it.
Yes.
And they have a test which essentially looks at how crystal clear the water is following that process. And the amount of aluminium that's allowed in it is simply based on that. Nothing to do with anything to do with health or safety or anything else.
So basically, they can put as much aluminium in vaccinations or anything else for that matter as they wish, because there's no safety limit. There's never been a limit of how much aluminium.
Even when you read the literature with respect to the use of aluminium adjuvants in vaccines, you often see numbers given as to how much aluminium is in that particular vaccine, and sometimes they're written in a way which suggests that there might be some sort of regulatory type approval or something of that sort. Actually, once again, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. What it's to do with is the amount of aluminium that's used produces a certain type of antibody response. And what they're looking for is the optimal antibody response. That then becomes the optimal aluminium amount that they want to add. And it makes, often the reading of it, you get the feeling, but they're only allowed to put 1.25 milligrams of aluminium in that particular. No, they're not. The reason why that figure is used is because it produces the optimal immune response, and it's got nothing to do with the safety of aluminium. And this is possibly why, for some vaccines, we now see them increasing the amount of aluminium in those vaccines, simply because they're trying to optimize the antibody response.
So this is why they're using so much more in the HPV vaccines. In the Gardasil 9, I think it's 500 mgs of aluminium.
Micrograms. Yeah.
So that's a heck of a lot in comparison with other vaccines that we've seen aluminium being used in.
Yeah, one of the great fallacies about human exposure to aluminium through vaccination is people say, yes, but it's only 500 micrograms, half a milligram of aluminium. Yeah. That's just a fraction of, for example, the aluminium that might be in your diet every day. And therefore, this cannot have any consequence. And, for anybody who's worked on aluminium for all of their lives, for 35 years like myself, it just makes me sort of cringe to hear this sort of stupidity. because the suggestion that a route of exposure, for example, aluminium in your diet via your gut, is identical to a route of exposure when aluminium that is injected directly into the muscle and therefore into your bloodstream, is just ludicrous and meaningless and shows a complete and utter lack of understanding of biology. Of course, often the people who say this don't have a complete lack of understanding of biology. They simply want to try to find some sort of overarching argument against the fact that what they see as a small amount of aluminium in a vaccine could have any possible deleterious effects. The other point is that, let's say you've got half a 0.5 mgs or 500 micrograms of aluminium in a vaccine preparation. So that's normally added in a total volume. The vaccine volume could be as much as 1 mil, it might be slightly less. So the concentration you've got is 0.5 milligrams per mil. Now that, if we work that one out, we normally like to give a concentration in as per litre. So per mil, that's 1,000, so we have to multiply the 0.5 by 1,000, that becomes 500. The concentration of aluminium that's been injected directly into the skin or into the muscle is 500 milligrams per litre. 500 milligrams per litre. Imagine, I started my research looking at aluminium toxicity in fish. 0.2 milligrams per litre killed fish. So we're using 500 milligrams per litre of aluminium at the injection site. And the suggestion is that that is, completely safe and non-toxic. Well, first of all, that can't be right, because the way an aluminium adjuvant works is through producing toxicity at the injection site, and that's exactly what it does, and that's why you have a little red mark after an injection, inflammatory response. So first of all, again, what everyone has to realise, and people working in immunology know this, is that the adjuvant works by producing toxicity.
Yes.
Now, if the toxicity only remained at the injection site, if it only produced mild inflammation at an injection site and nothing else, and there was no export of toxicity away from the injection site, then no one, including myself, would have too much of a worry about the use of aluminium in adjuvants. Of course, the reality that we're beginning to show more and more now is this is not the case, and that the aluminium at the injection site is transported away from that to diverse areas in the body, including the brain, where it could produce toxicity, and this is our worry.
And of course the girls are often, mainly it's been girls but now boys as well, have been actually having vaccines at Gardasil with other vaccines which also contain aluminium at the same time. Would this have more of an effect, do you believe?
Well, the first thing, again, the interesting thing about aluminium is, so clearly we all accept it's an adjuvant. We all accept that it has adjuvant qualities. It has adjuvant qualities producing inflammation at the site of injection. So why isn't aluminium also an adjuvant elsewhere in the body? So if that aluminium ends up in the brain, is it not an adjuvant in the brain too? Could it not produce inflammation there too? One of the things that are less widely appreciated is that aluminium is also an antigen. In other words, it has been shown by some of the very best groups working in mono and polyclonal antibodies in the world that you can raise antibodies against aluminium.
Yes.
Now this means that when the body first receives a significant dose of aluminium, now a significant dose would, something like a vaccination would be a significant dose because you have a huge concentration. It's in a small area, but it's a huge concentration. A significant dose of aluminium can essentially produce its own immune response. In other words, a memory. The body develops a memory to an exposure to aluminium, which means that the next significant exposure to aluminium, the body starts to produce an immune response against that. And not only potentially against that, but then of course, if aluminium is distributed elsewhere in the body, those other sources and sinks of aluminium can also become part of that. So where you start to have potentially multiple exposures to aluminium over short periods of time, you raise the possibility of producing a cascade of events, not only at the injection site, but around the body. Right. And this is, again, a real worry. And one of the things that we've always, again, tried to say, that if it is inevitable that you have to have a vaccine with an aluminium adjuvant, then there should be a significant period of time between them. You should not be having them with hours, days, or even weeks. You should be having them as long as possible between those individual vaccinations.
What I'd like to discuss is the studies, because it is our belief that studies actually, when they were studying this particular vaccine, the HPV vaccine, they were also using a placebo, but the placebo also contained aluminium. Could you explain that, please? And why would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, HPV is probably not alone in this, but it's a very good example whereby, I mean, the truth is that the vast majority of vaccine safety trials using an aluminium adjuvant have not been carried out correctly. And they've not been carried out correctly because the control or the placebo was the aluminium adjuvant, or sometimes another vaccine which had an aluminium adjuvant in it. So imagine you get a certain proportion of adverse events attributable to the adjuvant only. All of these would then be discounted from the vaccine, and the vaccine would be shown to be safe. Now, this is sort of what's happened with HPV. To begin with, things like Cervarix. Cervarix has a combination adjuvant, a combination of an aluminium salt and an oil. And yet, when you look at the safety trials for Cervarix, the oil was not included. It only included, I mean, they shouldn't have had an aluminium-only placebo anyway, but even their placebo was inaccurate. The suggestion being, of course, that there's no way in which these two things would combine in any way. Of course they combine, that's where they're being used. The reason why we have an aluminium plus an oil working together as an adjuvant is because together they produce a stronger effect than alone.
So if these were used in the trial, but weren't used in the vaccine after the trial, this really sort of makes the trial inaccurate altogether.
It totally does.
It totally wipes the trial out.
What in many ways is quite incredulous is that I commented on this in a paper recently in The Lancet, and the authors of the safety trial and the people who were following up on the efficacy of the vaccine, they admitted it. They said, but we don't think it's important. It's enough for someone to say, well, we don't think it's important. Actually it's it completely negates totally not only the trial itself, but the ethical approval for that. Every single clinical trial has to have rigorous ethical approval. Every clinical trial I have been through has taken months, sometimes years, to obtain ethical approval. You must not digress from what you gained ethical approval for in the actual trial. And they have clearly done that. They have gained ethical approval for one thing, which is not the same as what they've done again themselves. And this should completely, first of all, it's against the law, and secondly, it should completely negate the results. Now, the other example, of course, is the Gardasil. And Gardasil, in many ways, is proven to be even more controversial than Cervarix. And it's more controversial because Merck, who make Gardasil, include in it a proprietary adjuvant, which only they use, as far as I know, and mainly they've only used in the HPV vaccine. And this is, so we are told, a sulfated version of another aluminium adjuvant called a hydroxyaluminium phosphate adjuvant. Now, with the other two main forms of aluminium adjuvant, commonly called AL hydrogel and Adjuvos, we can buy those from the makers of the adjuvant, and we can spend time understanding them, we can research them. We cannot do that with this proprietary Merck adjuvant.
Why?
We have asked them to provide us with it, and they've refused to do so. Even though, for example, they published a paper, Caulfield et al., back in 2007, one of the studies, initial studies looking at their own adjuvant. They published something on it. Now, one of the prerequisites of scientific publishing is that if you have something published, then you must be able to provide somebody else who is interested with the materials and methods so they can check your paper. They can look at the reproducibility of what you've done. Merck have refused to do that, and no one has made them do anything about that. Now, we've asked them repeatedly, just give us the adjuvant so that we can understand it and compare it along with Adjuvos and with AL hydrogel. Why have they done that? Why are they refusing it? Well, why indeed have they chosen to use a new and proprietary adjuvant other than those that have been in use for decades previously? I'm not saying that the ones used previously are safe, but at least we knew a lot more about them. You can only suppose that the reason why is because the two other forms didn't work for this particular antigen. Whichever of the HPV epitopes they were using, it did not produce the antibody titer response that they required. So they have manipulated one form of an aluminium adjuvant, and they've made it more toxic, essentially. More toxic, so it will produce a greater response, a greater antibody titer to fit in with their requirements.
Surely that then this particular vaccine, Gardasil, has other ingredients that are also quite toxic, polysorbate 80 for instance. How does the aluminium actually react with all these other ingredients?
Yeah,
it seems to be the only vaccine, and I've researched vaccines for many years, it seems to be the only vaccine that is out there that has all of these different things in it. And it's very difficult to understand why.
Because we aren't able to get hold of the adjuvant itself, it's very difficult to do anything like that, to be able to say, right, can we look at any synergistic or other types of effects between the other different components that are present. I have no expertise on some of the other things like the surfactants, like polysorbate 80 and things that are used in there. And, if I had to hazard a guess, first of all, I read a lot. People, not necessarily scientifically minded, telling me that some of the other components will do this to the aluminium or that to the aluminium. There's no evidence that this is correct. So we have to be a little bit careful about somebody extrapolating from one thing to another. Do lots of things often work in different ways together? Yes, of course they do, and that's why we need to be able to test it. But the toxicity that this particular aluminium adjuvant is exerting at the injection site, I don't think it actually needs much else to help it out. As an example, in Merck's own safety trials, and I'm not sure which of the Gardasil that I'm referring to now, but you'll be able to sort of fill me in on that. But when they compared the vaccine with everything in there, including this proprietary aluminium hydroxyphosphate sulfate adjuvant, with their placebo, which was the adjuvant, again, which is the wrong thing to do, the first thing they found was essentially the same numbers of serious adverse events in these two. But those numbers were huge. Those numbers were the highest, I think they're the highest numbers, frequency of serious adverse events for any known aluminium adjuvanted vaccine, or indeed any vaccine. And they equate to something between 2.3 and 2.5%, which is 25,000 recipients becoming ill following HPV vaccination with Gardasil. And that illness, of course, can range from, you know, a temporary numbness in the arm to death. You know, this is the continuum that is called serious adverse events. There are data, again from Merck, which I have seen, where they claim to have also had a saline-only group. Now, a saline-only group would be a more appropriate control group.
Well, that's what I believed a placebo is supposed to be.
Well, exactly.
That's my understanding to begin with.
It's a more appropriate control group than simply using the aluminium adjuvant. Their data, now the saline-only group was for a very small number of individuals, gave 0 serious adverse events. 0. So even from those, it's very difficult to conclude anything other than all of these serious adverse events are due to the aluminium adjuvant, this new and proprietary aluminium adjuvant. And you know those numbers are, you know, clearly unacceptable. But if you're selling the vaccine, you say that there's no difference between the control and the vaccine, and therefore it's safe. And that's what happens, and that's what happens all the time when you use something which already produces toxicity as the control. Now, of course, the other aspect of those trials is they're all relatively short-lived. They don't follow up the individuals. I think it's 90 days, I can't remember exactly what it is, but they don't follow them up for months or years. They simply follow them over a relatively short period of time. So within that short period of time, we're seeing people with serious adverse events. And of course, there are many, many examples of particularly young ladies, young girls who have suffered from HPV vaccination. Many examples all over the world of this. And many of those, it did not take very long for these, for their symptoms to develop.
I know that you've been studying aluminium for 35 years, and I've always found it interesting with this particular vaccine, in particular the HPV vaccine and particular Gardasil. There seems to be a wide range of adverse reactions from some have paralysis, some have epilepsy, others have chronic fatigue, others have autoimmune disease. The list goes on and on and on. And I've seen mental illness. I've got parents coming to me and asking me to write, articles on this. And why I wanted you to make the audience clear is it because the aluminium is collecting in different parts of the brain or different parts of the body that's affecting the different parts of the body? Do you believe it's the aluminium that is causing this? I know you've studied it in
well,
brain.
you know, one of our objectives is to try to establish why there are serious adverse events following vaccination with an aluminium adjuvant. And that includes all serious adverse events. One of the things that is nearly always unknown is the aluminium status of the individual prior to receiving a particular, let's say, HPV vaccine. And one thing for certain is that in a let's take an example of in a class of girls of 30, it's very unlikely that any of them are going to be identical in that respect. They're not going to be identical with respect to their previous exposure to aluminium. They're not going to be identical in terms of the way their body handles aluminium, in terms of their genetic makeup, which is involved in this process. So, when they receive the HPV vaccine, they will all react to it differently. And those manifestations are what we see. The majority actually do not produce anything in the short term which we would consider to be serious. But a proportion, as we've said, up to 2.5% will do. And those are because probably they've had some sort of previous exposure to aluminium, which has meant that they have already significant sources of aluminium within their body or in certain areas of their body. They may also be predisposed to certain ways in which aluminium is able to travel around the body. So, for example, we suggested in our recent research looking at aluminium in the brains of individuals who died with autism, that we asked the question, why would it be that a 15-year-old child who died with a diagnosis of autism would have such a huge amount of aluminium in their brain tissue, because we know essentially that a lifetime exposure to aluminium does result in high levels of aluminium in brain tissue, but this is a lifetime exposure. Why then does a child have levels which are much higher than are seen in people in their 80s, 90s, or anything older than that? And the only possible answer to that is that their genetic makeup is such that they are predisposed to some sort of mechanism which is allowing aluminium to go into the brain and possibly be retained and accumulated in brain tissue. Now, these are the sorts of things that we need to be able to understand and research. They're the type of things we're not able to do so. But there will be predispositions within the population, which means that they will suffer differently to an aluminium exposure to somebody else. And it's common sense, really. Why would one expect anything otherwise? You sort of only...
Sorry, can I just ask then, would that explain why some of the girls or children who feel they've been adversely affected by the vaccine are now suffering anxiety, depression, some of them don't want to be social anymore? So could it feasibly be that they are now showing some symptoms of autism themselves? Could that be a possibility, do you think?
I can't remember whether I talked about this previously on film or not, but I remember in my very early days working on aluminium toxicity in fish, and you're going to think, what's this got to do with what you just asked me? But you're exposing this fish, a salmon, to low levels of aluminium in the water, the amount that's allowed in our drinking water at the moment, and you're watching what they do. And within a relatively short period of time, within a few days, what you notice is the fish, this is not a concentration of aluminium that is killing them, but what you notice is that they start to orientate themselves in their tank in a completely different way. In other words, where they go to the corners of the tank. They almost look as if they're against surfaces. They won't stay in the centre. They become, in some way, their neurobiology changes, their behaviour changes. And of course, that, when I saw it, first of all, I found it slightly upsetting, one of the reasons why I eventually came out of doing any animal studies. But you sort of thought, well, this is, at least if nothing else, it's telling me that their behaviour and therefore their neurochemistry is being altered by this. And of course, when you look at some of the other animal models that have followed, mice, etc., there are many of these traits. And these traits, yes, they are in an animal, but these are traits which we see in humans too. So, yes, it is not impossible that aluminium combined with other things is altering the behaviour of individuals in their future.
Right, I know that you've been studying the effects of drinking a super-rich mineral water for many years now, and I was wondering, have you come across any parents with daughters particularly that have been damaged with the HPV vaccine improving after drinking a silica-rich mineral water?
Yeah, well, the question you ask, I mean, again, I could go back and you'll cut all of this out if you like, but I'd go back to my early work with fish, because actually what I found with fish was, I was saying, well, look, I know that aluminium is killing the fish, how can I protect them? And just through pure scientific serendipity, I was able to show that silicon protects against the toxicity of aluminium in fish. And of course, the whole of my career now really is all about silicon being the natural antidote to aluminium and aluminium toxicity. And as part of that, we also learned about probably as much as 20 years ago now, that if you drank something which had a high content of biologically available silicon, we call that silicic acid, then you produced aluminium in your urine. It helped you to remove aluminium from your body. So we took it down to its simplest level, and we took mineral waters which have high content of silicon, high content of silicic acid, and we said, well, does that help to remove aluminium from the body? And the answer has been yes, it does in healthy people, it does in people with Alzheimer's disease. We've just finished a big study on multiple sclerosis, it does in people with multiple sclerosis. So we do have a significant amount of anecdotal evidence from a wide range of people suffering from many different conditions which they at least think aluminium has a role to play in. I have probably over the years come across, I don't know, maybe 50 or more cases of where someone who believes they've been damaged by a vaccine has benefited from drinking a silicon-rich mineral water. There are probably cases where someone who believes they were damaged or has been damaged by the HPV vaccine has also benefited from it. And top of my head, I have one or two in my head, but I want to talk about them immediately because they may not want to be, talked about on film, etc. The question is, the value of a silicon-rich mineral water appears to be that it will, if it's treated in many ways as a lifestyle and not as a medicine, it will slowly but surely remove aluminium from your body, which means aluminium from all of your body. There's no reason why it won't remove it from the brain, the bone, or anywhere else. But as I say to many people, it's not a magic bullet. And there's a huge so-called detox community out there, and they want to detox this and detox that. Well, detox nearly always seems to refer to something you do for a week or 2 weeks and you feel better. My philosophy on silicon-rich mineral waters is simple. First of all, we should all be drinking them. We should drink them before we have any symptoms of any disease. We should start to drink. We should be drinking more water anyway, so why not make it silicon-rich? We should all do so from as young an age as possible, because it is more likely to be preventative than it is to reverse damage that's already been produced. Because even in the case of, when aluminium induces damage, damage also produces damage. Damage kills, we see this often in things like cell culture and stuff of that sort. A dying cell kills another cell next door. Once you have damage, it itself can spread almost like an infection in the brain or elsewhere. So we need to get to a point in many ways where we can prevent that early damage. Now, if you can start to reduce the amount of aluminium in all the different stores around the body, then, for example, if we did have something like we talked about earlier, where you had an exposure to aluminium and the body remembered a previous exposure and mounted an immune response against aluminium, if those stores are small, that immune response will not be effective. It will not produce inflammation and damage in those areas. So, yes, I firmly believe that all of us would simply feel a whole lot better if we had less aluminium in our bodies. And the question is, well, how can we achieve that? At the moment, the only non-invasive effective way that I can recommend is a silicon-rich mineral water. We say try to drink a litre a day, every day, for the rest of your life, and see how it goes. That's what we would say. Now, clearly, you can also do lots of other things to avoid aluminium anyway. You can try to avoid it by not eating too much processed food, but it is inevitable. Even someone like me who understands aluminium and human exposure to aluminium probably better than anyone else on the planet, I still cannot guarantee being able to avoid aluminium in my everyday life. And in fact, in some things, I love
practically impossible.
I love my wine. Wine has aluminium in it, so I'm not going to give it up. But I am going to drink a silicon-rich mineral water at the same time. So I'm trying to balance everyday life with trying to reduce my overall exposure to aluminium. And I think we can all do that. We should be asking for things like, in the same way as we have myriad ingredients posted over all sorts of products these days, then why are we not told when aluminium is there? Sometimes it's disguised as an E number or something like that, which no one has any idea about.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's there simply as a contaminant. Well, it should be measured and we should be told about it. So, for example, one of the scandals that we've raised is aluminium in infant formulas. So we talk about infants being vaccinated and receiving aluminium adjuvants in vaccines, but at the same time, their only other source of nutrition is full of aluminium.
Yes.
Now, this is not a good thing. This is creating a future problem for most infants, and for some, it creates an immediate problem. And if you're one of those infants who is predisposed, probably genetically, to retain aluminium in brain tissue,
Yes.
and you've received a vaccination, and you're on infant formula, then I'm sorry, you're also an infant who's probably predisposed to some sort of neurological condition. And that neurological condition could happen in your infancy. It could be something like autism.
What the audience would probably be interested to know exactly, what is a silica-rich mineral water? I know, but for the audience that we're doing this interview for, and also which are the waters that have the recommended silica-rich mineral water to actually help them?
Yeah, I mean, there are very, very few, depending on where you live in the world, the natural water, your drinking water, will always have silicon in it. The silicon in water, dissolved silicon, is something called silicic acid. It's a silicon atom. It's got surrounded by 4 OH groups, and it looks a little bit like water itself.
Yeah.
Water is almost the closest analogous molecule to it. Silicic acid can follow water everywhere in the body. Now, this is the form, this is what we're famous for, looking at the chemistry between that molecule and aluminium. It has no other chemistry. So that should tell us a clue. This silicic acid has no organic chemistry, no other inorganic chemistry. It only has chemistry with aluminium. Why is that? That's probably because God decided that was the best possible thing.
Yeah.
Because that would keep aluminium out of living things and we would have life on Earth. And that's my thesis. So silicon is present in all natural waters. In some natural waters, it's present in much higher amounts.
Yeah.
Now, these are much rarer. They're generally in areas where the Earth's geology is young, where you are getting new mountains being built. So, for example, in areas where there are volcanoes and this type of thing. The reason that is because a mountain grows. A mountain is made of aluminium, silicon and oxygen. But after a mountain has grown, it also dissolves. Rain falls on it and it dissolves over time. So we won't live long enough to see it, but Everest will dissolve. That's what happens over hundreds of millions of years. Mountains grow and mountains dissolve. Now, when they dissolve, the first element of the aluminium, silicon, oxygen that comes out is the silicon. And so where you get these environments where that is happening, you get waters rich in silicon, high levels of silicon. In the United Kingdom, there are we are a relatively old geology, our island, so none of our potable waters are really rich in silicon. The southeast of England has the highest levels of silicon, again because of the geology, but these are not levels where our research has shown that they will be particularly active in removing aluminium from the body. They will be protective, but they will not be particularly active in removing aluminium from the body. Actually, the majority of drinking waters come into this category around most of the world, in fact.
Yes.
But where you have natural springs, artesian waters, others, some of those are really rich in silicon, and they're bottled. So I'm no fan of bottled water. I would prefer to drink from the tap, as I have done for most of my life until my research in this area changed things. But you simply cannot get the amount of silicon that is present in some of these silicon-rich mineral waters that you can in any potable water system. So here in the United Kingdom, we do not have any natural springs which are high in silicon. But in many areas of Europe, they do.
Yes.
And what we've tried to do is define a silicon-rich mineral water, and we've tried to define that based upon the research we have to date, which is by no means complete. And we've chosen a level of around 30 milligrams per litre, or 30 ppm, written as silica on the bottle.
Yes.
Which is a bit confusing because people see silica and they think that's the active ingredient. There's no silica in silicon-rich mineral waters. It's just something from the water authorities' way of reporting that has meant that that term has been used. And this is why we have the confusion with silicon and silica supplements. So you can go to Holland and Barrett or any other of your health food stores and the shelves will be full of silicon supplements. And often they will be using my research to try to sell their product. And indeed, unfortunately, their product does not deliver silicic acid when ingested and will not help to remove aluminium from the blood. They may have other benefits which we do not research.
Right.
Silica is a very sticky substance, so things can stick to it, so it might help you to flush things from the gut, but it won't take anything from inside the body. Silicic acid works by going from your gut into your blood, throughout your tissues, harvesting aluminium and enabling it to be excreted in your urine.
So it's not actually a silica-rich, it's a silicon-rich.
Silicon-rich, and that's why I use the term silicon-rich all the time. And again, the cut-off 30 milligrams per litre, but written as silica, 30 ppm.
Right.
Nearly all write it as silica, not as either silicon or as silicic acid, which are analogous. So 30 ppm silica is actually about 14 milligrams per litre of silicon or silicic acid.
So the waters that we should be looking out for in the shops, I know there's not very many in the UK, but there are a few. Which ones would you recommend?
Well, you know,
the one online, which is
I'm not going to name waters because I communicate with people all over the world. And what I always say is this definition of silicon-rich mineral water.
Yes.
So, you know, if I could tell you stories. I mean, when we first started to research silicon-rich mineral waters, my wife and I went to the supermarket and said, right, what have we got on the shelf? And we found, for example, Volvic. And so that was the first silicon-rich mineral water that we used in our clinical trials. But before we used it, we contacted Danone, who are the owners of Volvic. But did we get any reply? Did we get anything from them? Did we get even an acknowledgement? Nothing whatsoever. Indeed, they only acknowledged anything when we published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease our first clinical trial, showing that Volvic helped to remove aluminium from the bodies of people with Alzheimer's disease. All of a sudden, Volvic were on the telephone talking to us.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that relationship didn't last very long either, because when the parent company found out that Volvic were thinking about supporting our research, they put a lid on it. Because Danone is a huge nutrition company,
yes,
which uses massive amounts of aluminium in everything that they do, including their packaging. And they did not want to support something which was suggesting that aluminium might be bad for you. And then, you know, one of the other things I find a little bit galling is that, so the US, you know, the US is where something like a trend takes off in a massive way.
Yes.
And silicon-rich mineral waters have taken off in the US. However, their choice of silicon-rich mineral water is almost non-existent. It's Fiji water.
Fiji.
It's
Yes, you can't
almost
buy it over here.
the only one that they've got there. Again, you know, Fiji never ever replied to any of my approaches whatsoever. But then you look at the background to the company, you see that the company is actually, Fiji are owned by a larger company which owns many others, including one that provides all the aluminium cladding that the American houses use on their houses. And there are so many different conflicts of interest that, again, they are not going to help out. The one company that did respond to me is Spritzer in Malaysia.
Yeah.
And so they provided us with mineral water free of charge for our subsequent clinical trials. And that's why we've used them in all our subsequent clinical trials, because they would provide us with the water free of charge. And good for them for doing that. And of course, that's why you can now buy this in the UK as a Silas. And that's the one we use in our clinical trials. But there are many silicon-rich mineral waters available throughout Europe and the world. Not so many in the UK.
No, that is a shame.
Can I just go
Would you
back?
like to ask a question?
Could I just ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you. Just to go back to the HPV vaccine itself, with the aluminium, I'm just interested to know, because when a lot of the girls in this country who feel they've been injured, you go to the doctor, they're having new symptoms, and the doctor often says, well, no, it's been quite a few weeks since the vaccine, can't be the vaccine.
Yes.
Could you just explain whether aluminium takes some time, say, to get to the brain, or would you expect to see symptoms always immediately, or can it take weeks or months for symptoms to start appearing after aluminium toxicity?
Well, perhaps one way of answering that is that only a year ago I wrote a paper published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease Reports, which said essentially that my conclusion after 30 years of working on aluminium and Alzheimer's disease is that aluminium is a contributor to Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Right.
Alzheimer's disease happens after decades of exposure to aluminium. In other words, in the vast majority of people, you do not get sick immediately from aluminium. However, that is when you have what we might call the usual exposure, primarily in your diet, perhaps in the sorts of things you're doing on a regular basis, the use of cosmetics. If you're a smoker, perhaps you'll be getting a little bit of aluminium in that way. We all get aluminium through air pollution and these small particulate materials that are measured in air pollution. So the general and slow accumulation of aluminium in the body, we're excreting it all the time as well, so there's a balance, but the balance is always in favour of it accumulating, particularly in areas like the brain where we have a particular types of cells which do not divide, and so once it's there probably for life and just can accumulate over time. Now, with respect to a vaccine, of course, what you're looking at is, how long does an immune response exist following a vaccine? How long does the memory generated by the vaccine exist? These days we're now told it's maybe 5 or 10 years. Well, so if that memory is there, then the memory is also there with respect to the exposure to aluminium. In other words, there is no period of time over which something will develop.
So it's quite feasible that the
It's not
injuries...
even, it's likely.
It's likely
Yeah.
that the injuries the girls are seeing, previously healthy girls, the injuries they're seeing weeks, months, and in Japan, I think the research there on some of the girls affected said that the average time was about 350 days, so
Yeah.
virtually a year. So it is quite feasible that these injuries
These are people
aluminium related.
who are suffering debilitating conditions. This is not,
Yeah.
again, like a poisoning in which you immediately feel ill and you have to have something removed from your body. This is a situation where your body is trying to respond to something. We are very robust. Our bodies are very robust. It is putting up a defence, but that defence is then in many cases failing, and that failure can take days, weeks, months, years, and that is what potentially is happening. One of the studies that we should do with respect to, in particular, I think HPV, is a silicon-rich mineral water study. As far as I know,
Great, let's do it.
as far as I know,
Interesting.
even though we have documentation of many, many cases, particularly in places like Japan, etc. I haven't seen any systematic attempts to see whether a lifestyle change, such as an introduction of a silicon-rich mineral water, benefits those individuals or not.
And if you could do that, how would you be measuring the outcomes of the effect of the silicon-rich water? Do you think you would look at...
the main thing, people feel better.
Yes.
You know, I mean,
it would be a good study to do.
we can talk about all sorts of things. We could say, well, we're going to measure the urinary aluminium excretions, and a lot of people are always asking this, how can I measure my aluminium levels? And you know, one of the things I say to them is, first of all, that's not a trivial thing to do. You know, it's taken me a long, long time to produce data on aluminium in human body tissues that is robust and reliable. So it's not trivial even to measure aluminium in urine. Secondly, it's not cheap. It's expensive. And very few places can do it. Very few places can do it. Many places will do it, but very few places can do it. And so the majority of the time I say to people, don't worry about measuring your aluminium. My science tells you that if you drink a silicon-rich mineral water, you will excrete aluminium in your urine. You tell me, after weeks, months, years, do you feel better? And that's what we're looking for.
Yes. So would your advice be, if there are any doctors or healthcare professionals in our audience today, would you say to them that perhaps when girls come to them saying that they felt ill and they think there might be a connection to the vaccine, that it would be worthwhile actually documenting that and perhaps discussing with other healthcare professionals so that we can start to have discussions around the vaccine? Because
Absolutely.
our experience is that vast majority of cases when the girls go to the doctors, they are told that it's in their heads, they're being lazy, any number
if you've got a progressive,
excuses.
if you're an infant or a girl or a child or whoever you are, an adult who's lucky enough to have a progressive GP who's willing to think about alternatives, then that GP, general practitioner, consultant, if they were to say, look, maybe it's got something to do with your aluminium exposure, which could be the vaccine, it could be previous exposures that we don't know about, it could be a combination. Why don't we introduce a silicon-rich mineral water into your everyday life? Why don't you keep a diary of how much you drink and how you feel? And let's do that now for 3 months, and you come back and see me in 3 months.
That would be a brilliant idea.
Brilliant.
Wouldn't it?
Well, I'd like to conclude this interview, and thank you very much for speaking to us.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Pleasure.
Good luck with your meeting.
Thank you.